It's Friday morning here on BBC One, and time for breakfast.
Hello, good morning, it's Friday. Welcome to Breakfast with Charlie State and Victoria Derbyshire.
Our headlines today. Local election results come in across England. The Conservatives lose seats, including the key London borough of Wandsworth. Labour make modest gains, and the Liberal Democrats say they're picking up support.
Counting will begin later this morning for the local elections in Scotland and Wales, while in Northern Ireland they're voting for a new government.
Good morning. Reacting to the economic warnings, with interest rates rising, inflation expected to peak at 10% and fears for the economy, I'll explain what's happening and what you can do to protect your personal finances.
Good morning. After an incredible night for Rangers, they dance into the evening at Ibrox after reaching the final of the Europa League, their first European final in 14 years.
Will Young speaks for the first time about the death of his twin brother Rupert, who took his own life after years of struggling with alcohol addiction.
I didn't manage to keep him alive, and that's part of my grief process. There's only so much I can do for someone. There's only so much any of us can do for anyone.
And in weather, a bit more in the way of heavier rain around for at least a time today across the northern half of the UK. Further south you are, it stays dry, it stays sunny and reasonably warm as well. Have all the details on that and your weekend forecast here on Breakfast.
Good morning, hello, it's Friday, it's the 6th of May and our main story. Counting has begun across England following yesterday's local elections. The results are going to be seen as a significant test for the government after weeks of rows about lockdown parties and the rising cost of living.
Later this morning, ballot boxes will be open for council seats in Scotland and Wales, and also for Northern Ireland's Power Sharing Assembly at Stormont.
But for now, let's have a look at what we know so far in England. Elections have taken place in 146 local authority areas, with more than 4,000 seats up for grabs.
In just over half of those council areas, counting has already begun. Here's the state of the parties so far. Our latest figures show the Conservatives have lost 101 council seats. Labour has gained 28 seats. Meanwhile, the Lib Dems have gained 46 seats, and the Greens are up by 20.
Our political correspondent Helen Catt has the story so far. Hopefully.
For the Conservatives, it's been a night of anticipated but still painful losses. Wandsworth in South London, Tory for 44 years until now. Even in an election about local services, having the lowest council tax in the country didn't keep it blue.
The cost of living crisis did come up, as did the massive cuts from the government since 2010, and also Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was a vote winner for Labour, as indeed was Keir Starmer as well. And I'll remind you, Hugh, in 1998, a year after our landslide victory, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth. In 2002, a year after our landslide victory in 2001, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth, and we've done it in 2022.
Wandsworth's former leader blamed the loss on the cost of living and said what he called the issue of Boris Johnson was raised. That was echoed by some Tory councillors elsewhere.
It's Partygate, it's not just Partygate. There's the integrity issue. Basically, I just don't feel people any longer have the confidence that the Prime Minister can be relied upon to tell the truth.
The Conservatives lost Barnet in North London too, West Oxfordshire and Southampton, although others maintain things aren't as bad as they could be.
And where people are unfortunately turning away from the Conservative Party because we're mid-term, people want to make an understandable protest vote in the usual way, they seem to be going to Greens, to Independents, sometimes to Lib Dems, less so to the Labour Party, particularly out of London.
Labour has talked of making progress from the general election in 2019. It won the newly created Cumberland Council in the northwest, but it's not expecting big gains, and it's had losses too. The Liberal Democrats, who've had a strong night, took Hull Council from it.
Just shows you that this evening we're making gains in the Tory blue wall seats that we're targeting for the next general election, and we're taking seats off Labour in places like Hull. We took a seat off Labour in Sunderland earlier. In fact, we were the only party to make gains in Sunderland, both against the Conservatives and against the Labour Party.
The Greens too have made gains. Also overnight, in Bristol, voters chose to scrap their mayor in a referendum. This is all only a partial picture. Almost half of England's councils have yet to start counting and will do so later today. Helen Catt, BBC News.
So let's catch up with our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. Morning to you, Adam. Wouldn't life be a lot easier for people like you if on a day like today you could have clear winners and clear losers and it would all be very straightforward? It's not that kind of day, is it?
Yeah, Charlie, back to you. No, it's we're kind of in the fog at the moment where there's quite a lot of results, but still loads of results to go. And we're trying to work out what the patterns are. Where it is pretty clear is what's happening in London, because they've counted lots of their votes quickest. And it looks like Labour are going to take control of 3 big councils: Wandsworth, Barnet and Westminster. And so that would be very, very highly symbolic to take those 3 councils from the Conservatives, where the Tories have been in power for decades and decades and decades. And Labour will be really, really happy about that. The question is, how well does the party perform elsewhere in the country? And it's looking like they're going to do about as well as they did in 2018 when Jeremy Corbyn was in charge, which kind of calls into question this rhetoric you're going to hear from Labour Party people this morning, that this is a real turning point for them. And also they lost control of Kingston upon Hull Council to the Liberal Democrats, who are making quite a big gain in the number of councillors that they're getting. So then the focus will then turn to the Conservatives, who seem to have had quite a bad night, but they were expecting to have a bad night. They told everyone that they were going to have a bad night. And you're starting to see a bit of criticism of Boris Johnson from kind of outgoing council leaders. I just saw a Conservative MP saying that maybe it's time for a reshuffle to bring in some fresh people into the cabinet. What will really matter as far as the Conservative Party is concerned is, at the end of today, have they just had such a drubbing beyond what they expected that more Conservative MPs decide to submit letters calling for a vote of confidence in Boris Johnson. The Greens seem to be doing pretty well in England as well. Really interesting that in Bristol they've decided to just end that experiment that they've had for 10 years of having a directly elected mayor. Still loads of results to go. Also, Scotland and Wales, we don't really know anything there yet. And I think the big kind of really constitutionally significant thing for the whole UK will be the results in Northern Ireland, which will be trickling out today and over the weekend. And that could have real consequences for the Good Friday Agreement, which has secured peace in Northern Ireland, and it sets the rules for how the Northern Ireland Assembly and the executive work. And I think that could end up being the huge, big, dramatic story over the next few days.
Adam, thank you very much.
Well, as Adam mentioned, Labour has taken control of Wandsworth, which has been a flagship Conservative council since 1978. Our reporter Charlotte Rose is there. What are people telling you about the reasons why it's gone from Conservative to Labour?
Well, Victoria, it has, as you said, been a historic night here. Labour have overturned 44 years of Conservative rule. The final tally, Labour 35, the Conservatives 22 and 1 independent. The outgoing leader of the council, the Conservative Ravi Govindia, has been talking to the BBC and said that some of the issues that came up on the doorstep included people's concerns about the cost of living. But he said, as an administration, they have taken action to deal with that. He says they've cut the council tax, they've also frozen rents and reduced bills on services and things like that. And he said that he found it disappointing that he felt that he delivered and the Conservatives had delivered for the borough of Wandsworth for 44 years, and now they found that that has meant nothing to local people. He said it was a sad reflection on the importance of local government. But he did also say that the issue of Boris Johnson had come up when he'd been talking to people. He didn't want to delve into what exactly that meant, but he said it had clearly been a factor, but he didn't call for Boris Johnson to quit or to stand down. But there's clearly a feeling that's emerging about the impact that national issues are having on these local elections. And as we've seen here, a new dawn is breaking this morning, and here in Wandsworth, it's a red one.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Thank you. And if you want to... Oh, sorry. If you want to, I was going to say, if you want to find out the result
It's
in
all
your...
good information.
It's all good information. Doesn't matter who delivers it.
No.
Then go to the BBC News website or the BBC News app. Enter your postcode. It's so straightforward and it's really, really helpful. It will hopefully tell you who's won in your area. Although remember, there's still loads of counting to go, as Adam said, and there's analysis of what's been happening around the country. Now,
time now to get the news, travel, and weather where you are.
Very good morning. I'm Assad Ahmed. So already some of the biggest headlines of the local elections are being made in London. There's been a seismic result for Labour in Wandsworth. The last time they won there, it was 1974. Here's our correspondent, Carl Mercer.
From early on, the Conservative faces were painting a picture of what was to come in Wandsworth. Among the anxious onlookers, the former council leader and former Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, Sir Eddie Lister. A Tory flagship borough since 1978, Wandsworth is now run by Labour.
Councillors, we're here. You're my mum's councillor, yeah? No pressure.
On hand for the celebrations, London's mayor, himself a former Wandsworth councillor. Wandsworth's new leader wasn't even born when his party last ran the borough.
I think they felt the Conservative council had grown stale and complacent. It just didn't really have values that fitted with modern London.
We need to, in fact, make sure that all those people who feel that we haven't fully supported them or looked after their interests, we need to find out how well we can do it. We also need to actually hold the Labour Party to account on the promises they have made.
Losing a borough they've run for the last 44 years should serve as a warning to the party in London, says one Conservative watcher.
If they lose their flagship councils and they risk losing even more seats, and their seat count is already well down where it was even in 2010, I think the Conservative Party does need to it can't afford to just write that off and say, well, London is a Labour city. It needs to have a real reckoning with why this party of government, is so unappealing to sort of 8 million voters in this country's capital.
We now have 3 Labour MPs and a Labour council!
Victory then for Labour, who just happened to have the posters on hand. Carl Mercer, BBC London.
Well, let's go to Wandsworth now and speak to our correspondent, Susanna Mendonça. How big a deal is this, Susanna, for the Tories to lose Wandsworth?
Yeah, this is a massive loss for the Conservatives. This was a flagship Tory borough. They'd held it for more than 40 years and they lost it to Labour, and Labour won with a comfortable majority. Labour got 35 seats. We've got Conservatives on 22, one independent. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, was here and he was saying that this shows that Boris Johnson is now a vote winner for the Labour Party. The Conservatives here were reluctant to blame Boris Johnson for this loss, but there will be many out there who might well do.
Yeah, it's a fascinating picture emerging. Susanna, thanks very much for now. Well, let's get the weather forecast now with Kate.
Good morning. It's a bright start this morning. Plenty of warm sunshine around. Through the afternoon, though, we've got a cold front sinking south, and that's going to introduce more clouds. Staying dry, still some bright and sunny spells in the far southeast, and temperatures reaching a warm 22 Celsius. Overnight, that cloud continues to move across. A spell of mainly light rain, clearing by Saturday morning. A cloudy day on the whole for Saturday. The chance of a spot of rain, maybe 1 or 2 brighter spells, and temperatures staying in the high teens.
Well, let me just bring you some news which is coming in, and we understand that it's possible, just possible, that Westminster has gone to Labour in the last few moments, and that's for the first time ever. Well, whatever the situation, join us in half an hour. We'll bring you the very latest. Bye for now.
Hello, this is Breakfast Friday morning with Charlie State and Victoria Derbyshire.
Yes, time is 6:31, so our programme this morning, as you'll be well aware by now, is all about those local election results. Many of the results in overnight, many more yet to come. Just worth picking up on one story we're seeing in the wires right now, not one the BBC is able to absolutely confirm right now, but the suggestion is that Labour has taken control of Westminster City Council in London. Why is that so significant? Well, it would be the first time since its creation in 1964 that had taken place. But we'll keep a close eye on that. Many results are still to come in, and we'll try and give you a clear picture as possible of how it's looking this morning.
So that's 2 flagship Conservative councils, Westminster and Wandsworth, which have gone to Labour. It's also been a positive night so far for the Liberal Democrats. In the first change of control of the night, they took Hull from Labour. So let's talk to the party leader, Sir Ed Davey. Hello to you. Good morning. How are you feeling?
Really good. I mean, lots of results to come in, but it looks like it's going to be a historic night for the Liberal Democrats. We're making big gains from the Conservatives in their heartlands in places like Wimbledon and West Oxfordshire, and in places in the north like Stockport. We took that seat off Labour, as you mentioned, in Hull, and a huge vote of confidence actually in Liberal Democrat-run councils like Richmond, where there's complete takeover. There's only one Tory councillor left, and so this is very positive news. I said yesterday that voters could use their ballots to send a message to Boris Johnson that he failed to provide the leadership on the cost of living emergency, which was the issue that voters were raising, and I think they've sent that message, and lots of Liberal Democrat councillors have been elected.
Professor Sir John Curtis, who's the expert in these matters, as you know, he says for the Liberal Democrats, so far last night, a notable advance, albeit from a relatively low past baseline. Is that fair?
Well, actually, 4 years ago, when many of these seats were last fought, we did really well. 4 years ago, we took control of Richmond Council, of Kingston Council, of South Cambridgeshire and elsewhere. So actually, we've been making a lot of progress over a number of years now. And I think that's very promising for the next general election. Liberal Democrats will be fighting particularly Conservatives in many seats at the next general election. And what was really interesting about last night's results, in places like Wimbledon and Cheadle and elsewhere, we were winning seats where we need to win seats in the next general election. So it was a great night for those councillors and for the voters who were putting their trust in those Liberal Democrat community activists, the Liberal Democrat champions. We're very well known for being really good community politicians. But also, I think it sent a signal for that base for us to grow and defeat Conservative MPs at the next general election.
Right. I mean, again, I'm looking at what Sir John Curtis has suggested in terms of his analysis of your performance so far. The Lib Dems' performance is about as good as the one which it achieved in the 2019 local elections when it profited from Theresa May's difficulties over Brexit.
Yeah, John Curtis has said tonight, I heard him, that it was a very good night for the Liberal Democrats. So I'm happy to agree with John Curtis' verdict that we are the party making the biggest gains so far. And so, there is a sense now, I find, in the party, whether it's our by-election victories last year, where we beat the Conservatives in True Blue Buckinghamshire and Cheshire and Amersham, took a seat that no one thought we could win, and then winning in North Shropshire, a seat that Conservatives held for 200 years. There's now a real picture emerging across the country that in many areas, particularly areas held by Conservative MPs, it's the Liberal Democrats who are the real challengers.
And you talked about local issues and how you feel Lib Dems run local councils, but how much did national issues and the behaviour of politicians at Westminster play into this, do you think?
Victoria, it was a mixture of both local and national. It always is, let's be honest. I think the national issue, which was the biggest actually, was the cost of living emergency. Partygate and all that awful scandals from the Tory backbenchers, that was on some voters' minds. But I had far more conversations about people's worries about the cost of living. I think millions of pensioners and families are really worried, and they felt that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak and the whole Conservative government was ignoring them and taking them for granted. And actually, after the cost of living emergency, the other issue I heard most was the NHS crisis. People were really worried about the health and care for their families. So I think these are really big issues: the economy, our health service, and the Conservatives are not delivering.
Well, the Chancellor, if he were here, would say that he's come up with £9 billion worth of measures to help people who are struggling with the cost of living. And as far as the NHS is concerned, he would say that's the justification for raising national insurance, which is a tax that you want to scrap. And that rise will pay for the NHS.
Well, the Chancellor's failed to tax the windfall profits of the oil and gas companies. We've seen results from BP and Shell in the last two days which have confirmed what Liberal Democrats were the first party to say, was these oil and gas companies are making huge amounts of money on the flip side of the high heating bills and the high petrol prices that people are all paying. And it would be right to have a windfall tax, and we could use that money to have a big tax cut. We think a VAT cut to deliver £600 for the average family is one of the things we would like to do. We'd also like packages to help the most vulnerable, and the Chancellor isn't doing that. Liberal Democrats want a fair society where companies who are making these huge huge, unexpectedly high profits on the back of these global rises in gas prices, that they are asked to pay their fair share to protect people who are really struggling.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us this morning. Thank you, Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Davey.
6:37 Friday morning on Results Morning. What we need right now, Victoria, is a graph. That's what we need.
No, we need Lewis.
We need a graph, and we need Lewis attached to it. Lewis Goodall's ready and on standby. Sometimes it's helpful to have a graph, Lewis. Tell us a story.
Oh, I've got some graphs for you. Don't you worry about that. But before we get to the graphs, let's just look at the headline numbers, shall we? So this is the state of the parties as we are. About 8 or so hours counting into this thing. Labour, as you can see, they're already defending the most seats. They had the most seats, so you would expect them to be on top. But nonetheless, they've got gained 32 seats. It's an all right performance. The Conservatives down by 118. Lib Dems not having a bad night either on 57. But of course, the headline figures only tell us part of the story. So let's have a look at somewhere more specific. All the headlines so far, as we know, have been about Wandsworth, flagship Tory council since 1978. But let's look at some other ones as well. Westminster, the final results for Westminster. In some ways, I think this is actually more extraordinary than Wandsworth. We've known that Wandsworth was trending Labour over a long period. They won all of the 3 parliamentary seats in Wandsworth. They won Putney. People forget now, but Putney was the sole victory in the 2019 general election, the sole net gain for the Labour Party. So we knew that was on the cards. Westminster, was at the upper end of the Labour Party's ambitions in London tonight and over the last this election campaign. Look, they've now gained Westminster. It's the first time that it has had a non-Conservative majority since the borough's creation in 1964. This is the home, indeed, of the Houses of Parliament, of Buckingham Palace, of Mayfair, of Park Lane, of Marble Arch, of all these places you don't necessarily associate with a People's Republic or a Socialist People's Republic, but instead Westminster now control Westminster. And as you can see, Labour now control Westminster. As you can see, an absolute rout, really. 13 gains for the Labour Party, 13 losses for the Conservatives. So it has been a stonking night for Labour in the capital, but has that been replicated everywhere? Well, in some places, like Southampton on the south coast, well, they've not had a bad night there either. They've taken back control. To be fair, Labour only lost control of this council in 2021 after they had quite a poor performance, gained 4 seats, Conservatives lost 4. They'll be pleased with that. There's a key seat, Southampton-Itchen. Both of the Southampton seats, indeed, are important seats for the next election. Southampton-Itchen, in particular, Labour will hope to gain that. But then you look elsewhere, and things don't look quite as rosy, particularly if you go into the north of the country. So you've got somewhere like the Amber Valley. This had been Labour council actually not too long ago, but the Conservatives have actually been extending their hold here. They've gained 2 seats, Labour lost 4 seats, and that's the sort of pattern that you've seen in other places as well. Nuneaton, people will remember back in the 2015 general election, Nuneaton was the seat that the Labour Party had to win in that election. It has been slipping further and further and further away into the Conservative column. Got Labour, again, just going back modestly, but you would hope, if Labour would be hoping in a situation where they were going to be on the precipice of power, to potentially be taking seats like Nuneaton. But of course, it's not just the Conservative-Labour battle. We've also seen what's going on with the Liberal Democrats. Not been doing too badly. Places like West Oxfordshire. West Oxfordshire, this is David Cameron's backyard in Witney. It's been Conservative since 2000 and basically Labour Conservative control since before that. West Oxfordshire, Lib Dems have been doing very well for some years now. They've gained 4 seats. Conservatives lost 5. Conservatives it's gone into no overall control. And then if we just look at somewhere like Cumberland, this is somewhere where the Labour Party, conversely, this is what's a bit complicated about these results. You can't neatly say, well, the north is going a bit more Conservative, the south going a bit more Labour, because somewhere like Cumberland, it's a new council, there's lots of really key parliamentary seats there, places like Workington, which they lost at the last election, seats like Carlisle, seats like Copeland. Labour have got 12 seats, gained 12 seats there. The Conservatives lost 14. They've cleared the winning post, 24. And if we just have a look at, say, let's just compare something, shall we? I know you wanted that graph, so let's have a look at the graph. Labour performance within London compared to outside of London. Well, as you can see, Labour had a cracking election back in 2018 in London. They've still managed to advance on that, up 2%. Conservatives down 3, but outside of London, again, the picture's a little bit shakier. Labour down and the Conservatives down. The Lib Dems managed to gain. So it's a complicated set of results, not necessarily too easy to analyse. Of course, we've done a stellar job here with the screen, but as more results come in, we'll have a clearer picture. But so far, Labour, not a bad performance. not necessarily a performance that you would think they are on the precipice of entering government. The Conservatives, well, it's not a terrible performance given that they're 12 years into government, but on the other hand, it is a real retreat by comparison to where they were, certainly in 2019, but even compared to a year ago in 2021, where they had a very creditable local election performance indeed.
Lewis, it's all good information. Thank you very much, and we'll catch up with you a bit later on. I know lots more coming in all the time. We'll see you then.
Thanks, Lewis. One of the areas that turned Conservative in the 2019 general election was Newcastle-under-Lyme, and Navtesh Johal is there for us this morning. Morning.
Good morning. Yes, welcome to the Apedale Heritage Centre here in Newcastle-under-Lyme, not far from Stoke-on-Trent. This area has a proud mining history, and that's something which this place celebrates and teaches people about. You can see some of the trains and equipment that the miners used to use around me. It's actually been built on the site of a former mine. But in recent weeks, it's votes rather than coal that the political parties have been searching for. So why has there been so much interest in the Newcastle-under-Lyme Borough Council elections? Well, let's find out by speaking to the Radio Stoke political reporter Joanne Gallagher, who joins me. So Joanne, why are political types, pundits, all so interested in what's happening here?
Morning. Well, it's because this really could set the picture nationally. This here in Newcastle-under-Lyme, the council, is exactly the type of council that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Conservative Party need to keep hold of, and which Labour's Sir Keir Starmer really need to try and take back. This area voted Brexit, they voted to leave, they voted for a Conservative MP, Erin Bell, in 2019. Previously, they'd had a Labour politician covering this area. So we headed into the election here with the Conservatives having just a one-seat majority. 4 years ago, when voters went to the polls, there was no overall control. So there really is everything to play for here.
Yes, a very slim majority for the Conservatives at the moment. What are voters saying at the moment about how they're feeling and how the party's feeling too?
The main issues here, the environment plays a big part here in Newcastle-under-Lyme. People concerned about public transport, the state of high streets. But also there's the Stop the Stink campaign here. Wally's Quarry, just a few miles from where we are at the moment, is letting out this awful, obnoxious smell where people across the political divide have campaigned on. There's actually 3 independent candidates who are standing in Newcastle-under-Lyme on that Stop the Stink ticket. How they work out today when we get the votes and what votes they take from Labour primarily, I think, could be the difference between the Conservative hold or Labour taking it. So that's a really big issue. Now, as far as what the politicians are saying, Conservatives still quite confident they can stay in overall control, but then the Labour leader I was talking to last night says, yeah, slightly confident, not as confident as Tuesday, but still thinks possibly they could take this council.
And so that's the big question, isn't it? So how do you think things are going to play out? We're expecting results sometime this afternoon, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. If I was a betting woman, I would say it's really too close to call. The count starts at 9 in Keir Hall in the ballroom, so I'm going to get my dancing shoes on the ready. And as you say, hopefully around 3 o'clock we should get a result. But if there's recounts, it could go much later into the day. But too close to call here.
OK, Joanne, thank you. Well, we'll be hearing from some voters, some local voters, later in the programme too. And as Joanne says, 9 o'clock is when the count begins, expecting results sometime in the afternoon, around maybe 3 o'clock.
Navtesh, thank you very much. And the impression you'll be getting this morning as we're trying to bring you the results is, as Navtesh was saying, different counts happening at different times.
Yes.
So some of them haven't even started yet. Some of the results are already in.
Yeah.
We'll try and give you as clear a picture as we can this morning of what we already know.
Mike's here. It's coming up to 7 o'clock. Let's bring you the news, travel and weather where you are.
Very good morning. I'm Asad Ahmed. Now, without question, the biggest results of the local election are in London. Labour have taken control of the Conservative jewel in the crown, Westminster, for the first time ever. There have been other significant results too. Here's Nicola Ford.
A huge win for Labour in Westminster, a borough they've never won before.
I'm delighted, I'm tired. We've been working so hard for this, not only just over the last few years, but over decades, to try and make the case for Labour in Westminster. And I'm delighted that we've finally had the breakthrough today to make history here in Westminster.
The Conservatives in shock. It's been theirs since 1964.
Labour, 1,100.
In Barnet, another historic moment for Labour. They've never won an outright majority here. Concerns over anti-Semitism, a factor here last time, barely registering now.
4 years ago, the main issue was about anti-Semitism, hardly came up on the doorstep. So I think in that, certainly Labour is no longer the tainted brand, and we've turned a corner on that.
For the Conservatives, their faces said it all. Their leader said lessons must be learned.
I think this is a warning shot from Conservative supporters, and I think our loss today was not only due to the factors I've just mentioned, but also a fair number of Conservative voters who just didn't go out to vote, stayed at home.
With the loss of now Westminster, Wandsworth and Barnet, it will be hard for the government to ignore. Nikki Ford, BBC London.
Well, let's go to Thomas McGill now, who's in Barnet. Thomas, tell us what's happening there.
Well, Assad, this is one of Labour's key targets across this campaign, and they've given everything towards the campaign. Now, as it stands at the moment, we're just waiting on one more ward to declare. Labour at the moment have 38 seats and the Conservatives have 21. So a massive swing to Labour, who now have a majority here of 17 seats. Now, Labour will be here in power in Barnet for the first time, and they acknowledge that that's going to have its challenges. But given the win here that's already been accepted and the win in Wandsworth, there's a real confidence amongst these guys who are waiting on the next result.
OK, Thomas, thanks very much. Now, straight on to the weather with Kate.
Good morning. It's a bright start this morning. Plenty of warm sunshine around. Through the afternoon, though, we've got a cold front sinking south, and that's going to introduce more clouds. Staying dry, still some bright and sunny spells in the far southeast, and temperatures reaching a warm 22 Celsius. Overnight, that cloud continues to move across. A spell of mainly light rain, clearing by Saturday morning. A cloudy day on the whole for Saturday. The chance of a spot of rain, maybe one or two brighter spells, and temperatures staying in the high teens.
Now, results are still continuing to come in from across London. Another seismic shift has been in Wandsworth, which Labour have won for the first time in nearly 50 years. I'll be back with our next update in half an hour. Hope you can join me then. Bye for now.
Good morning, it's Friday morning. Welcome to Breakfast with Charlie State and Victoria Derbyshire.
Our headlines today: local election results coming in across England. The Conservatives lose seats, including the key London boroughs of Wandsworth and Westminster, to Labour. The Liberal Democrats say they're picking up support.
Counting will begin later this morning for the elections in Scotland and Wales, while counting in Northern Ireland, where people have been voting for a new government, starts at 9 a.m.
Good morning. McColl's on the brink of collapse. The convenience store chain says it's now increasingly likely it will fall into administration, potentially putting thousands of jobs at risk.
Good morning. What an incredible night for Rangers. They dance into the evening at Ibrox after reaching the final of the Europa League, their first European final in 14 years.
There's a new Master Chef in the kitchen. We'll be joined by the winner of last night's final after another intense series draws to a close.
And many of you will see rain at some point in today, but southernmost counties of England, the dry story continues, and it's here we'll see the best of the sunshine and the day's warmth. All that coming up, the full forecast here on Breakfast.
Hello, it's Friday, the 6th of May. Our main story: counting has begun across England following yesterday's local elections. The results will be seen as a significant test for the government after weeks of rows about lockdown parties and obviously the rising cost of living.
So later this morning, ballot boxes will be open for council seats in Scotland and Wales, also for Northern Ireland's Power Sharing Assembly at Stormont.
But for now, let's have a look at what we know so far in England. So elections have taken place in 146 local authority areas, with more than 4,000 seats up for grabs.
As it stands, in just over half of those council areas, counting has already begun. Here is the state of the parties so far. Our latest figures show the Conservatives have lost 121 council seats. Labour has gained 35 seats, and the key Conservative councils are Wandsworth, Westminster and Barnet. Meanwhile, the Lib Dems have gained 57 seats. Let's have a look at the Greens as well, up 23.
Well, our political correspondent Helen Catt has the story so far.
And
For the Conservatives, it's been a night of mostly anticipated but still painful losses. Wandsworth in South London, Tory for 44 years until now. Even in an election about local services, having the lowest council tax in the country didn't keep it blue.
The cost of living crisis did come up, as did the massive cuts from the government since 2010, and also Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was a vote winner for Labour, as indeed was Keir Starmer as well. And I'll remind you, Hugh, in 1998, a year after our landslide victory, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth. In 2002, a year after our landslide victory in 2001, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth, and we've done it in 2022.
Wandsworth's former leader blamed the loss on the cost of living and said what he called the issue of Boris Johnson was raised. That was echoed by some Tory councillors elsewhere.
It's Partygate, it's not just Partygate. There's the integrity issue. Basically, I just don't feel people any longer have the confidence that their Prime Minister can be relied upon to tell the truth.
The Conservatives lost Barnet in North London to Labour too, and in a bigger upset, Westminster and Southampton, and they lost control of West Oxfordshire. Although some maintain things aren't as bad as they could be.
Where people are unfortunately turning away from the Conservative Party because we're mid-term, people want to make an understandable protest vote in the usual way, they seem to be going to Greens, to Independents, sometimes to Lib Dems, less so to the Labour Party, particularly out of London.
Labour has said it's a turning point for the party. It won the newly created Cumberland Council in the northwest, but it's not expecting big gains, and it's had losses too. The Liberal Democrats, who've had a strong night, took whole council from it.
And what was really interesting about last night's results, in places like Wimbledon and Cheadle and elsewhere, we were winning seats where we need to win seats in the next general election. So it was a great night for those councillors.
The Greens too have made gains. Also overnight in Bristol, voters chose to scrap their mayor in a referendum. This is all only a partial picture. Almost half of England's councils have yet to start counting and will do so later today. So too will all of the councils in Wales and Scotland. And counting will start for all 90 seats in the Northern Ireland Assembly, with polls suggesting that Sinn Féin could become the largest party for the first time. Helen Catt, BBC News.
So let's go straight to our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. Now, morning to you, Adam. This is the point of the morning when you give us a very clear picture as to exactly what has happened and what it all means.
That's the aspiration, at least, Charlie. We're still waiting for lots of results to come in, especially Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, where they've not even really started counting yet. So that's the big caveat. The simplest way of describing this is that the picture we've seen in the opinion polls for the last few months, with Labour ahead a bit, seems to have been replicated in the real world with real voters in their local elections in England. So that's kind of the big picture. The big symbolic wins for Labour have been those big 3 Tory councils in London, including Wandsworth, which has been in Conservative hands for more than 40 years. But those wins are significant, but they are mostly symbolic because Labour already piles up loads of votes in London. It's what sort of votes does it pile up elsewhere? And that's an interesting open question. The Tories are saying privately, Keir Starmer is not making the progress in the rest of the country that he needs to if he wants to be Prime Minister. But then Labour is saying, no, they feel that they're at a turning point. If you compare the results now with how they did at the 2019 election, it looks pretty good. However, if you compare Labour's results now to the last time a lot of these seats were fought in 2018 under Jeremy Corbyn, Labour's performance looks actually a bit flat. Let's see how that feels, though, when we hear the news from Scotland and Wales throughout the day. And in terms of the Conservatives, there have been a few complaints about Boris Johnson, but on the whole, outgoing Conservative councillors and now former leaders of Conservative councils that they've lost are being quite kind of generalised in their criticism. Yeah, they're blaming Boris Johnson a bit, but they're also saying that the Downing Street, Whitehall lockdown busting parties came up and that the cost of living came up a lot. So I wonder if a threat to Boris Johnson as a result of these results will not materialise. The Liberal Democrats and the Greens very happy in England, though, because they've been getting lots of council seats, and the Liberal Democrats took control of Kingston upon Hull Council from Labour. So it just shows there is really quite a lot going on in these results. And because there's quite a lot going on, that means people can cherry pick their favourite ones and say that they've done the best.
OK, Adam, we'll catch up with you later on. Thank you very much.
So, as we've been reporting, Labour has taken control of two key London councils, Wandsworth, Westminster and Barnet. Here's Newsnight's Lewis Goodall to talk you through it. Lewis.
So London has been, people often ask us why we're talking about London so much at the moment. Well, it's because they're counting overnight. Many places are not. And there have been some really quite remarkable results in London so far. Now, there was a lot of attention always going to be paid to Wandsworth. Why? Well, it has been this so-called flagship Conservative borough. Conservative since 1978. Pretty salubrious, wealthy in the main part of southwest London, and here they are. Labour have taken this borough. They had it in their sights in 2018, didn't quite manage it, got 35 seats, really doing it with getting the seat with the borough with room to spare. 8 seats net gained. Conservatives lost 8, but that wasn't the only scalp that the key Labour Party has managed to take from the Conservatives in the capital. Westminster in many ways is more surprising still, because it's been Conservative since 1964. This was at the upper end of where the Labour Party was hoping to get in London tonight, and they've really stormed it, really. 13 seats gained, 13 Conservative losses. Really quite remarkable. As I say, they really weren't expecting that, the Labour Party. If a source told me actually earlier this evening, they only really got wind that it was competitive a few days ago and diverted resources to it. Barnet, somewhere else that they were hoping to gain in 2018, didn't do so, probably because of the anti-Semitism crisis within the Labour Party at the time. Barnet, a very Jewish area of North London, weren't too enamoured with the Jeremy Corbyn leadership, but this time the Labour Party have managed to take it. 12 seats gained, 12 seats lost from the Conservatives. You'll notice too, all of these areas, of course, all strongly Remain voting, and this is part of the continued realignment that we're seeing in British politics. We've spoken about it in electoral cycle after electoral cycle after electoral cycle, and it is behind why the Labour Party is now so dominating in London overall. 70 seats, parliamentary seats also in London. The Labour Party is already dominant in many of them. This is one of the problems really with the Labour Party doing so well in London alone. It is doing okay in some other places, but given they're already so dominant in London at a parliamentary level, they really won't be able to get a parliamentary majority that they so crave just from dominating in London alone. But Richmond, it isn't just the Labour Party that's doing well in London. Richmond, it was already a Lib Dem borough, but you can see here just the extent of the Conservative rout in the capital. Conservatives now only have 1 seat in this borough. This was a seat at a parliamentary level they held until relatively recently, but losing 10 seats, a real wipeout in the capital. Remember, as I say, you don't have to go back that far to find Conservatives having a majority of seats in the capital. Go back 20 or 30 years or so and you'd find that. Go back to even say 2006 in boroughs like Ealing. David Cameron's Conservative Party winning in boroughs like that, but no longer. The Conservative Party is essentially not facing quite extinction in the capital, but it is really struggling. After tonight, they will likely only control a handful of councils. They went into these elections controlling 7. They probably will end up with 2, 3, perhaps 4 if they're lucky. But of course, as I say, there are lots of other places that are voting over the course of that have voted over the course of the last 24 hours. And if you want to find out whether you can expect to see any results, all you need to do is go to the BBC News website, type in your postcode, go on to bbc.co.uk/news, BBC News app, and you can look at the results where you are.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Lewis. Thank you.
11 minutes past 7 now. Ben's joined us. So we're talking a lot about elections this morning, but a lot of people will be thinking about the economy more generally, and specifically this morning we're talking about jobs. Tell us.
Right, let's go back to our main story now. The results of England's council elections, which have been coming in this morning.
Yes, information coming in all the time. We're trying to keep you up to date on everything that's happening. We've been hearing 3 key London councils have passed hands from the Conservatives to Labour so far, but outside the capital, party is only making modest gains. Let's get the reaction now from Labour MP Shabana Mahmood, who's the party's national campaign coordinator. Thank you very much for your time this morning. I'm sure you've had a busy time looking at the results as they're coming in. What picture are you seeing from Labour's point of view?
Good morning. Well, look, it's a real turning point for the Labour Party. What we've seen from these early results that have come in is that we are making real progress on our 2019 general election result. That was our worst election result since 1935. It was a near-death experience for the Labour Party. And if you look at what these early results are telling us, it's that under Keir's leadership, we are making real progress, real headway in some of those key battlegrounds across England. And I'm confident that across the rest of the day, as results come in from Wales and in Scotland as well, we'll be able to show progress across the whole of the UK as we look ahead to that next general election. We've taken key local authorities off the Conservatives, as you've been speaking about in your programme. We've taken obviously Barnet, Wandsworth and Westminster here in London, but we've also taken Southampton, which has always been a bellwether area for general elections and what we can expect to see in a general election. And of course, we've taken the newly formed Cumberland Authority. If you overlay what these results are showing us in terms of the popular vote share of what's happening in parliamentary constituencies and what this suggests would happen in some key parliamentary seats, there are some Tory MPs that should be very, very worried, because on these results we would be winning seats such as Workington, such as Copeland, Hartlepool, Carlisle, Great Grimsby. We'd be taking 2 seats back in Wolverhampton, in West Bromwich. Across the whole of England, we would be making progress on these results as a result of Keir's leadership of the party. So it's a real turning point. We've made real progress. We have a lot more work to do. We're in no doubt about that, but this is a solid foundation for us to build on as we look ahead to the next general election.
It all depends who you ask, doesn't it? Because other people look at the figures we've seen so far and they say you're doing about as well as you did under Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, look, we went into these elections, these were last fought in 2018 in England, and we already held over 50% of the seats that were being contested in these local elections. So when you're already at over 50%, the headway that you have for very significant gains is obviously necessarily limited because you're already at an above 50% high point. So I think you have to take it in the context of the particular cycle that these local elections have been fought on.
So another
but you
way
have
of,
to then overlay
if I may, Shabana, another way of looking at that is that you're flatlining from 2018.
No, we've already gone into these local elections with more than 50% of the seats that were being contested, and we have made significant gains in areas that were held by the Conservatives and which are bellwether areas for general elections, which have always been seen as bellwether areas for general elections, such as Southampton, which is a really important gain for us. And on these results, we are able to show progress across the whole of the United Kingdom. I'm confident that we'll be able to show progress later on today in Wales and Scotland. But if you look at the seats that will be the absolute key parliamentary battleground seats between us and the Conservatives at the next general election, you look at what's happened in terms of the popular vote share in these local elections, in those parliamentary constituencies, we would be winning back seats that are currently held by the Conservative Party. They will be returning to the Labour Party at the next general election. That is the foundation that we've created in these local elections, and that we will be building on ahead of the next general election.
OK, reference, if you would, specifically Amber Valley, which is in Derbyshire, where Conservatives are gaining seats ahead of Labour. Now, why is that happening in that place?
Well, look, we are going to see local factors in some areas, and as I said, in the 2018 cycle, we were over at 50% of these seats that have been contested again last night. So in some parts of the country, we were able to show that we're able to make some gains, but our headway for very significant gains across the whole of the country is necessarily limited when you're already at over 50%. So we do have more progress to make in some of these areas like Amber Valley. But if you look at what's happening in terms of the popular vote share, we are taking the fight to the Tories in seats that the Tories currently hold that we need to win if we're going to form a majority Labour government.
I don't want to say the same thing over and over again. Apologies
no, but I think it's important that we set that in context.
Okay.
Of course, I would want us to be doing better in Amber Valley. We have more progress to make. I'm not saying that it's job done and that we've sealed the deal with the electorate, but we have built a solid foundation for us to build on ahead of the next general election, and this is a solid and good set of results for us overall.
Your share outside London, it is down.
But again, as I say, overlay those results of the popular share across parliamentary constituencies, and we would be winning Workington, we would be winning Hartlepool, we would be winning Copeland, Carlisle, Great Grimsby, we'd be winning in Lee, we'd be taking seats in Wolverhampton. We would be winning parliamentary constituencies across the length and breadth of England, and that is the progress that we need to be making ahead of the next general election.
We'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
It is 22 minutes past 7. Good morning, welcome to breakfast.
We'll bring you right up to date with all the local election results in just a moment, but it's time now to get the news, travel and the weather where you are.
Very good morning. I'm Asad Ahmed. It's been a historic night for the Labour Party in London. Earlier this morning, it took control of Wandsworth after 4 decades out of power. The last time Labour won there was back in 1974, and within the past hour, Labour have gained Westminster from the Conservatives for the first time ever. Here's our correspondent, Carl Mercer.
We now have 3 Labour MPs and a Labour council!
First they took Wandsworth, then came Barnet, and then the shock of the night, Labour took Westminster Council, completing a hat-trick of historic wins. London's mayor was in Wandsworth as the celebrations began.
Councillors, we're here. You're my mum's councillor, yeah? No pressure. Well, listen, it's for Boris Johnson to decide how he feels being the first leader in a generation to have lost this seat, Margaret Thatcher's favourite council. And when you speak to residents on the doorstep, as I've been doing in Wandsworth for the last few days and weeks, the 3 big things that came up was the cost of living crisis, was the cuts they were feeling from the government, but Boris Johnson came up.
Labour had never run Barnet Council, the beaten Tory leader blaming national problems for his party's woes.
So Partygate came up very occasionally throughout the campaign, not all the time, and there were some weeks when Partygate went quiet and nobody was bringing it up on the doorstep, and when it came up again, when there's a new revelation or a fine or something like that, then people would bring it up on the doorstep, and it really was an issue, I think, that impacted us. But I think even without...
And some Conservative watchers have warned these defeats in London need to be addressed by the party.
If they lose their flagship councils and they risk losing even more seats, and their seat count is already well down where it was even in 2010, I think the Conservative Party does need to it can't afford to just write that off and say, well, London is a Labour city. It needs to have a real reckoning with why this party of government, is so unappealing to sort of 8 million voters in this country's capital.
Labour now runs more councils in London than it has ever done. Carl Mercer, BBC London.
Well, the Liberal Democrats have held on to Richmond upon Thames and Sutton in southwest London. They gained 9 councillors in Richmond. The party currently controls 3 councils in London. OK, let's move on to the weather forecast now with Kate.
Good morning. It's a bright start this morning. Plenty of warm sunshine around. Through the afternoon, though, we've got a cold front sinking south, and that's going to introduce more clouds. Staying dry, still some bright and sunny spells in the far southeast, and temperatures reaching a warm 22 Celsius. Overnight, that cloud continues to move across. A spell of mainly light rain, clearing by Saturday morning. A cloudy day on the whole for Saturday. The chance of a spot of rain, maybe 1 or 2 brighter spells, and temperatures staying in the high teens.
Well, there's much more on the election on BBC Radio London with Vanessa Feltz. Tune in via the BBC Sounds app, your smart speaker, or on 94.9 FM. I'll have the latest on BBC One and the iPlayer in an hour.
Hello, good morning. It's Friday. It's breakfast with Charlie State and Victoria Derbyshire.
Time has just turned 7:30. Let's bring you right up to date with the local election results. Conservatives have suffered a number of losses in the local elections in England, particularly councils in London.
Outside the capital, though, it's been a mixed picture so far. Let's get an update on what we know. Newsnight's Lewis Goodall can explain everything for you.
Let's have a recap, shall we, of where we are. You can see 75 of 146 councils declared, so we're just a bit over halfway, so it's as good a time as any. You see, as we've said, Labour were going into this election defending the most seats, so you would expect them to be on top unless they'd had a really catastrophic night, and they haven't. In fact, they've made some modest gains so far, about 38 seats. Conservatives down by about 124. On a bad night, on a pretty bad night, they'd be edging towards 250, 300, which is entirely possible on the basis of the results we've seen so far. Lib Dems on 57, the Greens not having a bad night either, by the way, on 23. But let's just delve in a little bit more into some of the results. We've talked about London a bit, so let's ignore that for now. One of the stories of the night is a very uneven, patchy distribution of wins and losses for the Conservatives and Labour. So in some places, one of the things that we've been looking at is the Labour Party making advances in a sort of seats that they've been targeting over the last few elections to try and get back in the game, particularly outside of London, the big cities. So places like Nuneaton in Warwickshire. This was the seat that was really received so much attention back in 2015 when Ed Miliband was Labour leader. When he lost that seat, didn't win it back, they knew that Labour wasn't returning to power. And indeed, it's another story of continued loss in somewhere like Nuneaton. The Conservatives continuing to make gains. You can see back here, as recently as 2016, the Labour Party won this council. Hung in 2018, the Conservatives win it in 2021. Conservatives continuing to make advances this time. One seat there, 66% leave. Well, maybe there's a clue as to why that is happening. Part of that realignment that I've been talking about. Somewhere like Amber Valley, similar sort of situation. You've got the Labour Party in control of it as recently as 2019 up until 2021. The Conservatives take it last year. Labour Party continued attrition, -4. Conservatives up 2. Greens up 2 as well. That's part of the story of tonight. Sometimes Labour Party has not just been losing in some of these places to the Conservatives, but also to the Greens as well. But then, so you think you've got a pattern. But then you look at somewhere like Cumberland, for example. This is a new council in Cumbria. It's actually the borough council of quite a few significant parliamentary seats, places like Workington, for example, which the Labour Party lost in the 2019 general election. And actually, the Labour Party is a new council, so the seats all have to be notional, as it said. But nonetheless, the Labour Party have done very well. They've got 12 notional gains, 14 notional losses for the Conservative Party. They will be very, very pleased with that. The Conservative Party and a lot of those seats that the Conservatives won in Cumbria at the last general election, as I say, places like Workington, places like Copeland, places like Carlisle, those Conservative MPs are going to be very concerned about that. We heard overnight the Conservative leader of Carlisle Council expressing his concern, saying that he thinks that Boris Johnson needs to accept responsibility for results like that and he needs to go. So it's a complicated picture. And then you've got somewhere like Hartlepool, which the Labour Party is a good illustration of what I'm talking about. This was lost to the Conservatives last time. Of course, there was a parliamentary by-election where the Conservatives took this once rock-solid Labour seat. And Labour has not gone anywhere. They haven't won, they haven't lost. Conservatives won 2 from the independents. And this, the Labour Party actually says, believe it or not, they say it's progress. Because they say that had the Labour Party done as badly as they did in 2019, as badly as they did in 2021, just a year ago, then the Labour Party would have lost more seats. They wouldn't have stood still, they would have lost. They may have been eliminated from the council altogether. And so really that's the story of tonight in terms of the Labour Party's performance. It depends what your baseline is. If your baseline is doing better than 2019, the general election drubbing, doing better than 2021, the local election drubbing, under Keir Starmer's leadership, then there's real signs of progress. If your metric is the Labour Party on the verge of returning to government, well, on the basis of these results, if you were to extrapolate it, you've got to be very careful about that sort of thing, but you could easily see the Labour Party making gains, 20 gains, 30 gains, who knows? Would that be enough to eliminate the Conservative majority altogether? Enough to become the largest party? Enough to win your own majority? Well, on the basis of the results so far, I'm not so sure.
Thank you, Lewis. Thank you very much. Lewis Goodall from Newsnight.
7:35, let's turn our eyes away from the election for a moment. 7:41, let's bring you right up to date with everything in connection with the elections. As we've been hearing, 3 key London councils have passed hands from the Conservatives to Labour so far this morning.
Let's get reaction now from the Conservative Party chair, Oliver Dowden, who is at Westminster this morning. Mr. Dowden, good morning to you. Tell us your assessment of how you think you've done.
Well, of course, we've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture, because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains. And I think if you take the whole picture of this, it really doesn't demonstrate that Labour has the momentum to form the next government.
Can I play you a clip of the Conservative leader of Carlisle City Council? He's called John Mallinson. He said when he was out campaigning, Boris Johnson's character kept coming up. Have a listen.
There's the integrity issue. Basically, I just don't feel people any longer have the confidence that the Prime Minister can be relied upon to tell the truth.
How do you respond to that?
Well, I very much respect him, and actually I heard a slightly longer version of that clip on a previous programme I was on this morning, where he acknowledged that he'd never been the biggest fan of the Prime Minister in the first place.
He was talking about the people he'd met on the doorstep.
But nonetheless, I do accept that this election has been fought against a difficult backdrop. And I think what I take from this election, and what the government needs to take, is that people are fed up with all the distraction from Westminster, and they want us to focus on what's going on in their lives, and particularly at a time when we have this global challenge caused by both the crisis in Ukraine and, as we come out of COVID, of rapidly rising inflation. And you saw that just yesterday.
I would like you to address
cost of living. People want us to take focus and take action in respect of those things.
They do, and I'm definitely going to come on to the cost of living, of course. But I want you to address directly what your Conservative councillor John Mallinson was saying. People don't have the confidence the Prime Minister can tell the truth. That is fundamental, isn't it?
Well, I accept people's concerns about what has happened over the past few months. I actually think that the Prime Minister gave a very full explanation, both to Parliament and on the day that those fines were issued. And I have accepted what he said. And I think lots of people I've spoken to, of course, they feel anger and frustration about this. I feel anger and frustration about what happened in Dowden Street, and I've made that clear on previous occasions. But at the same time, people are also saying, well, hang on, this is the man that gave us the fastest vaccine rollout programme in the world, in Europe, not once, twice, but 3 times. He delivered Brexit as promised. And if you look at what's happening in the Ukraine right now, he's genuinely leading the Western world's response. And I think when you take those things in the balance, I think we need that kind of leadership right now.
Well, if we're looking at balance, I mean, Wandsworth, Conservatives can't hold on to Wandsworth with the lowest average council tax in the country. They're the only council in England to cut council tax this year. You've held it for 44 years. It's gone. Westminster has been Conservative since its creation in 1964. It's gone. And the former Conservative leader of Wandsworth said there were no worries locally with local issues. He said, quote, the issues of Boris Johnson were raised by many people.
Yes, well, again, I heard the comments from the leader of Wandsworth Council, and I pay tribute to all that he and his councillors have done. And
so
I'm very sad
I'm
very sad that we've lost them. And indeed, he referred to other things that have been in the headlines over the past few months. I would say that in Wandsworth, we unexpectedly held on to it last time by only 200 votes, and consistently for the past 20 years we've been losing support there, and we've got 3 Labour MPs there, not Conservative MPs. So of course it's disappointing, but it does form part of a wider trend. And when you look at outside places like that, if you look at somewhere like Hartlepool, we made gains. Thurrock, we made gains. Nuneaton, we made gains. In many of those councils, Labour have been in power for a generation. I simply don't think that if you look across these results, this isn't like what Tony Blair got in, say, 95, 2 years before his election victory. They were making 1,800 gains. If you look at Ed Miliband managed to make 800 gains in 2011 and still not win the election.
You seem keener to talk about Labour. You seem keener to talk about Labour than the Conservatives' performance overnight. Let me ask you about the cost of living then, because that obviously it's a huge issue for everybody. Earlier this week, the Prime Minister said there is more you can do to help people with their bills. What are you waiting for?
Well, first of all, it's really important to understand the global context of this combination of Ukraine and COVID are putting pressure not just in the UK, but America, across Europe. Everyone's struggling with this massive surge in inflation. no government is going to be able to buy people out of all of these problems. I just have to be honest with your viewers. It's not going to be possible. But we have taken
just a minute.
unprecedented.
I'm sorry. I'm confused.
We have taken unprecedented action.
I'm confused,
with over
Mr.
£22
Dowden.
billion worth of support. And if you look at the kind of measures we've taken, whether it's increasing the national living wage, that's £1,000 improvement to people's income.
Mr.
Whether it's
Dowden,
those changes
the Prime
to
Minister
the universal
said
credit
clearly,
threshold, again,
he said
that
this
makes people
week,
£1,000 better off. So we are taking action and will continue to do so.
Right, so I'm asking you, what are you waiting for?
Well, the point that I've been making to you, Victoria, is that we have already taken an extraordinary range of measures.
And the point I'm putting to you is that the Prime Minister made it clear
and the
this
Prime
week.
Minister has tasked us,
The Prime Minister said
the whole
there is
government
more
actually at Cabinet
we
to
can
take
do.
action across the board and to see what further measures we can take, because you would expect when people are hurting, and I know people are hurting. Now, I hear this on the doorstep, and we all see it. And I know your viewers will feel the same way. They're sat around the kitchen table or in the front room and thinking, how are we paying those bills? It's incumbent on the government to look to see every further measure that we can take. But what I would say is we have already taken an unprecedented amount of action.
Why are you waiting to do more?
Well, Victoria, we're not waiting to do more. In July, there'll be an increase in the threshold for national insurance contributions. That's going to make people better off to the tune of about £270. We've already increased the national living wage. That came in from April. That's £1,000 increase. In the budget, the Chancellor cut fuel duty by 5p. That's £100 improvement to families' finances. I, of course, accept that we need to continue to look to do more, and that's what we're doing. But there has been a constant stream of action from the government.
OK. The Bank of England said yesterday that the price cap on energy bills could go to £2,800. Inflation's going to hit 10% by the end of the year. Interest rates are at a 13-year high. A warning from the Bank of England that we're at the risk of recession. Taxes are at their steepest for decades because of decisions made by your government. What are you waiting for?
Well, we have big challenges across the board, and the Bank of England highlighted that. This is a situation that countries around Europe and the US, we've not experienced this for at least 40 years. This combination of us coming out of the COVID and rapid growth pushing up prices and the effect on the supply chains, and also this war in Ukraine. Actually, you highlighted tax. We have precisely taken action on that. The Chancellor announced plans to increase the national insurance threshold. That's cutting people's taxes. But I don't resile from the fact that when we were faced with this COVID pandemic, the effect, and I'm sure many of your viewers have seen this, in our hospitals, in our GP surgeries, the pressure that they're under, it demanded extra resources to go in. So that's why we made that increase to the national insurance contributions. That's why tax has risen over the past few years, because we were faced with this unparalleled situation. But we are now taking action to ease the burden on people through the measures that I have outlined to you, and I'm happy to talk about more of them.
We're going to leave it there, but thank you very much for your time, Mr. Dowden, Oliver Dowden, who is chairman of the Conservative Party. Thank you.
Cool job, his job.
Good morning. Hello, it's Friday morning. Welcome to Breakfast with Charlie Tate and Victoria Derbyshire.
Our headlines today. Local election results coming in across England. The Conservatives lose seats, including the key London boroughs of Wandsworth and Westminster, to Labour. The Liberal Democrats say they're picking up support.
Counting's getting underway for the local elections in Scotland and Wales, while in Northern Ireland, voters have been having their say over forming a new government.
Good morning. McColl's on the brink of collapse. The convenience store chain says it's now increasingly likely it will fall into administration, potentially putting thousands of jobs at risk.
Good morning. Rangers' dream run in Europe takes them all the way to the final now of the Europa League, prompting plenty of dancing around Ibrox on a famous night. They now have a chance to win their first European final and trophy in 50 years.
Will Young speaks for the first time about the death of his twin brother Rupert, who took his own life after years of struggling with alcohol addiction.
I didn't manage to keep him alive. And that's part of my grief process. There's only so much I can do for someone. There's only so much any of us can do for anyone.
And whilst many of you will see rain at some point through today, in some southern gardens it's going to stay dry yet again. Best of the sunshine, highs the temperatures here. I'll have details on that and your weekend forecast right here on Breakfast.
Good morning. Hello, it's Friday the 6th of May. Our main story. Counting is underway across England, Wales and Scotland following yesterday's local elections, and ballot boxes are being opened in Northern Ireland following Assembly elections there.
The results will be seen as a significant test for the government after weeks of rows about lockdown parties and the rising cost of living.
Right now, let's take a look at what we know so far. Across England, elections have taken place in 146 local authority areas, with more than 4,000 seats up for grabs.
In just over half of those council areas, counting has already begun. Here is the state of play so far. Our latest figures show the Conservatives have lost 124 council seats. Labour has gained 38 seats, and the key Conservative councils of Wandsworth, Westminster and Barnet. Meanwhile, the Lib Dems have gained 57 seats and the Greens up 23.
Our political correspondent Helen Catt has the story so far.
A symbolic win for Labour. Wandsworth in South London, Tory for 44 years until now. Even in an election about local services, having the lowest council tax in the country didn't keep it blue.
The cost of living crisis did come up, as did the massive cuts from the government since 2010, and also Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was a vote winner for Labour, as indeed was Keir Starmer as well. And I'll remind you, Hugh, in 1998, a year after our landslide victory, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth. In 2002, a year after our landslide victory in 2001, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth, and we've done it in 2022.
Wandsworth former leader blamed the loss on the cost of living and said what he called the issue of Boris Johnson was raised. That was echoed by some Tory councillors elsewhere.
It's Partygate, it's not just Partygate. There's the integrity issue. Basically, I just don't feel people any longer have the confidence that their Prime Minister can be relied upon to tell the truth.
The Conservatives lost Barnet in North London to Labour too, and in a bigger upset, Westminster and Southampton, and they lost control of West Oxfordshire, although some maintain things aren't as bad as they could be.
We've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture, because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains. And I think if you take the whole picture of this, it really doesn't demonstrate that Labour has the momentum to form the next government.
Labour has said it's a turning point for the party. It won the newly created Cumberland Council in the northwest, but it's not expecting big gains, and it's had losses too. The Liberal Democrats, who've had a strong night, took whole council from it.
And what was really interesting about last night's results, in places like Wimbledon and Cheadle and elsewhere, we were winning seats where we need to win seats in the next general election. So it was a great night for those councillors.
The Greens too have made gains. Also overnight in Bristol, voters chose to scrap their mayor in a referendum. This is all only a partial picture. Almost half of England's councils have yet to start counting and will do so later today. So too will all of the councils in Wales and Scotland. And counting will start for all 90 seats in the Northern Ireland Assembly, with polls suggesting that Sinn Féin could become the largest party for the first time. Helen Catt, BBC News.
So let's speak now to our political editor, Laura Koonsberg. Morning, Laura. I know you have watched all night as all these results have come in, so you have wise words for us this morning as you can paint a picture of what it all means.
Well, I'll do my best. They're wise words with 0 hours of sleep, and still more importantly, many, many more results to come in. Is you setting me quite a high hurdle to try and get over at 8:05, but I will do my best. Let's think about the big picture. So voters in England, in their wisdom, in a funny way, have given with one hand to both the big parties and taken away with one hand to both the big parties. What do I mean by that? Well, Labour have got some grabby sounding gains from the Tories, taking some of their iconic councils in London. Nobody expected Labour to take control, not just of Wandsworth Council, that's in the southwest of the city, but Westminster Council itself, where Boris Johnson's house in Downing Street is. And they have made big, quite impressive gains in London. And in some other pockets around the country, Labour are also picking up seats. In Cumberland and Cumbria, for example, we're an area where there's a cluster of 3 Tory MPs, if you're thinking about general elections. They've won the council there, and that for them is a decent gain. But here's the rub for Labour. Voters overnight have not given them the kind of result that Keir Starmer can look at and think, you know what, I am cruising my way to number 10, I am definitively on track. It looks very much like Labour will end up with the biggest share of the vote when we come to work out all of the numbers, but not necessarily the kind of slice of the pie that can make Labour feel comfortable about where things are heading. But they do have justification to call it a turning point for them, and we are going to hear them call it a turning point again and again and again and again. Then let's think about Boris Johnson's party. Well, they've had some pretty grim results, no doubt about that. They've lost those big councils in London. They've fallen back in other places like Southampton, down on the south coast. That's the kind of part of the country where general elections are fought and won, because their marginal seats are clustered around those parts of the country. So it's been a grim set of results for Boris Johnson. But has it been completely ghastly Armageddon? No, it hasn't been, actually. And if you think of what the Tories have gone through in the last 6 months, all those allegations, the Prime Minister found to have been broken the law, think about how people are feeling about their family finances right now. People are feeling increasingly hard up and concerned about what might lie next. But that hasn't turned into a really, really strong punishment for the government. And some of Boris Johnson's allies will say, well, we've been in charge for a long time. We're mid-term. The Prime Minister's been through a massive amount of turmoil in the last 6 months. This actually isn't a set of results that's too shabby. But the people who are feeling cock-a-hoop this morning are the Lib Dems, without question, and the Green Party too, who've picked up quite a lot of pace overnight.
So now you've given us a fine explanation, Nora. Where does this get us? Where does it get us in terms of what it tells us about the state of the nation? Because I'm already, and you'll have done this yourself, you talk to each different party and they're very happy to say whatever's in the moment. They can say, well, we got work to do. We're pretty pleased. Where does it leave us?
Well, in a funny way, Charlie, I'm not sure actually that this leaves things a huge... very, very different to how they felt a week ago or 2 weeks ago. You know, broadly, we've got a government that's had a hard time. We've got a government who some of their own supporters, some of their own MPs think has basically passed its best, who are not happy with what their leader has been up to. And we've got a government that many people around the country are questioning the faith that they had in them if they backed them in the first place. But we've got a government where we don't yet see definitively that swathes and swathes and swathes of voters are going to wake up when it comes to a general election and think, you know what, I feel so cross, I'm going to go out and be motivated to get them out. It just doesn't feel like they're in that kind of situation. By the same token, as we had last week and the week before, you've got an opposition party under Keir Starmer, in contrast to Jeremy Corbyn, who has been making progress, who has made changes to the party, who is normally ahead in the polls with a relatively decent margin, but not a leader who seems to be putting fire in people's bellies, who seems to be getting swing voters, people who change their minds in general elections to think, you know what, I feel really enthusiastic about the idea of a Labour government and what they might be able to do for me and my family. So in a funny kind of way, this set of elections in England, and I stress, I can't say enough, there's still so many numbers to come, and of course counting in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland too, which will bring all sorts of other stories and important issues to light. But it looks like the results in England, in a funny way, have been a bit of sort of confirming the position that we're at. And it matters so much because the assessments that people in politics normally make are based on surveys, polls, focus groups, instincts, what people are hearing anecdotally. And elections, even when they're local elections, and we've got to be careful because there's low turnout and people vote for all sorts of different reasons on all sorts of different issues, from their council tax to their bins to how they feel about the national parties. But local elections, they're a real test. There's people going into a ballot box with a pencil, putting their cross in the box. So the parties might not be surprised really by the pattern overall of these results, but they do matter, even if just to confirm what people sensed was really going on. And of course they matter in a brass tacks way, of course, because from today there's going to be different people making decisions on our behalf if you were live in one of the areas where the council was up for grabs.
All good, Laura. Is it tea or coffee? That's my question. Is it tea or coffee?
Oh, it's tea. I haven't had my first coffee yet. I think that after the last election, I was talking about what you have to do on an overnighter. You do tea all night and then coffee all day. You can't have drinking coffee all night, then there's just an absolute disaster. So you have to so I'm actually about to have my first coffee, and then that'll see me through till the 10 o'clock news.
We'll leave you alone to have a big slurp. Nice to see you. Thank you very much.
Very nice to see you too. Cheers.
One of the key areas that turned Conservative in the 2019 general election was Newcastle-under-Lyme. And Navtesh Johal is there for us this morning, and you are on some kind of contraption. Explain why, Navtesh.
Yes, good morning. Welcome to the Apedale Heritage Centre and Apedale Valley Light Railway. This is a place, an area which is proud of its mining history here in Newcastle-under-Lyme near Stoke-on-Trent. And this place teaches people about that history, the trains that they used to use, the equipment they used to use. But over the last few weeks, they've been more interested, the politicians and the candidates, in the votes rather than the coal around here. So why has the Newcastle-under-Lyme Borough Council election got people so exercised? Well, let's speak to BBC Radio Stoke's political reporter, Joanne Gallagher, about that. So, Joanne, why are politicians and pundits watching what happens here so keenly?
It's really important. It's because Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister's Conservative Party, really need to keep hold of authorities like this one in Newcastle-under-Lyme, and Labour under Sir Keir Starmer really need to start taking those seats back and winning councils like this. Previously, it had a lot of support amongst Labour Party. Recently, 4 years ago, it was under no overall control when there was a local election. Most recently, they went into this election, the Conservatives,
we'll just interrupt you for 1 second. We're going to show you these pictures of Keir Starmer, who has just arrived in the sunshine. This is in Barnet, of course, which is one of the Labour gains of the morning.
Yes, and Barnet, really significant for Labour because it's got a big Jewish population, and for the fact that Labour have taken this council would suggest that Sir Keir Starmer has been successful in ridding the party of anti-Semitism, essentially.
Yes, and as you see those celebration scenes, it is clearly worth pointing out that Labour have made those gains. We'll listen in for just a moment.
Yes. Winning in the north, Cumberland, Southampton. We've changed Labour, and now we're seeing the results of that. What brilliant teams we've got, all the fantastic work you put in. And when it comes to London, you can hardly believe it if those names come off our lips. Wandsworth! Wandsworth! They've been saying that for years, you'll never take Wandsworth. We've just done it! Westminster! The astonishing result. And here in Barnet, and thanks as I look around to each and every one of you and all the teams we had out doing that really hard work across London, across the country. We've sent a message to the Prime Minister. Britain deserves better. And I want to just say a few words about Barnet, because it was important for me to come here to Barnet, because my first words as leader of our party when I took over in April 2020 was that we were going to root out anti-Semitism from our party, not tolerate it anymore in our party, change our party. And I said the test of that will be whether the voters trust us again in places like Barnet. And they've done it! And that is your hard work. That's the change that collectively we've brought about in our Labour Party. The trust that we're rebuilding, that's putting us on the road to number 10, on the road to that general election. That change this last 2 years has been really hard for us as a party, but we've done it. We've built those solid foundations. We've won here in Barnet. We've won across London. We're winning from coast to coast. And I just want to say a massive thanks to all of you for your very special part in that here in Barnet. It's brilliant to see you on a brilliant morning. More to come as the day goes on. Massive thanks. Let's hear it for Barnet. Let's hear it for Labour.
So, Keir Starmer there, you can get a sense of the atmosphere. It's his first appearance of the morning. That's in Barnet, where, of course, Labour win in Barnet. Those other significant wins he was talking about, Westminster and Wandsworth, of course. It should be said, we haven't seen Boris Johnson this morning. Of course, we'll show those pictures if we see the Prime Minister. It is worth saying, as you hear that list of places where Labour have done well, when you look at the actual statistics, to Keir Starmer, they're very much enjoying the moment, but the Labour share outside of London is actually down. It's something we've referenced in a number of our interviews this morning. They have a few some shiny baubles, which are those places which are significant. We can talk to Nick Erdley, I think, who's there with him.
We're back on track now for the general election, showing what the change that we've done, the hard change we've done in the last 2 years, what a difference it has made. And, you know, Cumberland, very important win last night in key constituencies for the next general election. Same in Southampton. Many more results to come today. But I just want to thank our brilliant team.
A message for Londoners, Keir.
How much of it can be attributed to Boris Johnson? Let's move to Keir Starmer in North London. We're going to go back to another key constituency when it comes to the next general election, and it's Newcastle-under-Lyme. It went from Labour to the Conservatives in 2019, and Navtesh is still there for us. Sorry for interrupting, but I know you'll understand why, Navtesh.
Yes, of course, no problem. Well, we were just speaking to Joanne Gallagher, the BBC Radio Stoke political reporter. Joanne, why is this area so significant politically?
It's an area which voted for Brexit. It's an area that formerly had a Labour MP until 2019 when the Conservatives won with Aaron Bell, who interestingly only a few months ago came out himself and said that he'd lost confidence in the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And it's for issues like that around Partygate and local issues around the cost of living and the smell of a nearby quarry that will be interesting to see how that equates to votes, because this council, it's a really good indicator of the national political stratosphere, so to speak. Keir Starmer, Labour need to win this council back, and the Conservatives need to keep it. So it'll be really interesting to see which way this goes.
Yes, Joanne, they have that slim majority of Conservatives, don't they? Well, young voters, that is another issue here, how to engage them. And we've got a couple of them from Keele University joining us. Holly and Dan, thank you for being here with us from the Students' Union. Holly, first of all, how difficult is it to engage younger voters?
It's always difficult. I think students and young voters feel constantly let down by the system, and that's why they're less willing to engage. But we need to change that mentality, and we are changing that mentality by using our vote, which is the most powerful tool that we have to make change.
And Dan, what are the issues at the moment that younger voters are most concerned about?
One of the big ones is the cost of living crisis, which disproportionately affects students, especially living on student loans. A lot of students have 2 or 3 jobs to get by. Currently, the mental health crisis, so NHS waiting times are up. There's not enough funding in the system, and another one is the Stop the Stinks over landfill, which is causing both mental and physical damages to students, especially students who live quite closely to the landfill, and also when it's that bad it can affect campus as well.
Yeah, that's a big local issue, isn't it? And Holly, you've been finding an innovative way of encouraging young people to vote, which is something maybe Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson should pay attention to. What is it?
Yes, so recently I ran my Goats for Votes campaign, which brought a local petting zoo onto campus to encourage students to come and vote for the goats.
An innovative idea. How did that work?
Yeah, really, really well. It's amazing what a piece of bribery you can do with goats.
Great, maybe something for the main parties to think about. Thank you both. Let's also speak to Robert, who's one of the volunteers here and a former miner. Robert, you are what the political parties think of as a floating voter, though you voted Conservative last time.
That's correct.
What are the issues at the moment that you are most concerned about?
The issues are, apart from this terrible war which is going on, of course, and many are dying, the cost of living, fuels are soaring, and a certain arrogance of power, I think, in government with their Partygate, with their foreign holidays and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you were talking to me about that earlier. What is it about that, despite being a Conservative voter, you are quite frustrated by the Partygate issue?
Because it's a detachment from what people are thinking. Where there's been so much suffering and anguish in society, they've been able to party, and they should know better. Where are their advisors? Just get the job done and deal with the issues.
OK, Robert, thank you. Well, just before we go, we're going to speak very quickly again to Joanne Gallagher, the Radio Stoke political reporter. Joanne, very quickly, which way is it going to go this afternoon with the counting this morning? Labour or Tory?
It's too close to call, but I will tell you, Labour or Conservatives will definitely be one of the biggest parties.
OK, all right, Joanne, thank you very much. Well, 9 a.m. is when the count begins at Keir University. We're expecting a result around 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Navtesh, thank you very much. You get the picture. There's quite a few of these results. Counting's only just begun, or maybe not even yet, so it will take a little time. There is a way that you can find out what's happening or what has happened in your local area. There you go. You just put in the details, your postcode, and everything will pop up. Time now to get the news, travel, and the weather where you are.
Very good morning. I'm Assad Ahmed. The big local election headlines are all in London. Alongside Barnet, Labour have taken control of Wandsworth for the first time in over 40 years. And for the first time ever, Westminster Council too. Here's our political correspondent, Carl Mercer.
We now have 3 Labour MPs and a Labour Council!
First they took Wandsworth, then came Barnet, and then the shock of the night, Labour took Westminster Council, completing a hat-trick of historic wins. London's mayor was in Wandsworth as the celebrations began.
Councillors, we're here. You're my mum's councillor, yeah? No pressure. Well, listen, it's for Boris Johnson to decide how he feels being the first leader in a generation to have lost this seat, Margaret Thatcher's favourite council. And when you speak to residents on the doorstep, as I've been doing in Wandsworth for the last few days and weeks, the 3 big things that came up was the cost of living crisis, was the cuts they were feeling from the government, but Boris Johnson came up.
Labour had never run Barnet Council, the beaten Tory leader blaming national problems for his party's woes.
So Partygate came up very occasionally throughout the campaign, not all the time, and there were some weeks when Partygate went quiet and nobody was bringing it up on the doorstep, and when it came up again, when there's a new revelation or a fine or something like that, then people would bring it up on the doorstep, and it really was an issue, I think, that impacted us.
And some Conservative watchers have warned these defeats in London need to be addressed by the party.
If they lose their flagship councils and they risk losing even more seats, and their seat count is already well down on where it was even in 2010, I think the Conservative Party does need to it can't afford to just write that off and say, well, London is a Labour city. It needs to have a real reckoning with why this party of government, is so unappealing to sort of 8 million voters in this country's capital.
It looks like Labour could now run more councils than it's ever done in London. Carl Mercer, BBC London.
And in the past few minutes, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer arrived in Barnet to celebrate his party's success there. The borough has long been a Labour target, and earlier this morning the Conservative leader said the loss to Labour didn't bode well for the Tories in future general elections. Now the weather forecast with Kate.
Good morning. It's a bright start this morning. Plenty of warm sunshine around. Through the afternoon, though, we've got a cold front sinking south, and that's going to introduce more clouds. Staying dry, still some bright and sunny spells in the far southeast, and temperatures reaching a warm 22 Celsius. Overnight, that cloud continues to move across. A spell of mainly light rain, clearing by Saturday morning. A cloudy day on the whole for Saturday. The chance of a spot of rain, maybe 1 or 2 brighter spells, and temperatures staying in the high teens.
Well, there's more on the local election results in London and reaction too on our website and with Vanessa Feltz on BBC Radio London. I'll be back with an update in half an hour.
Hello, good morning. It's Breakfast with Charlie State and Victoria Derbyshire.
Time now is 8:32. Bring you right up to date, of course, with local elections. The Conservatives have suffered a number of losses in the local elections in England, particularly councils in London.
Outside the capital, it's been a mixed picture so far. We're going to get an update now on where we are. Newsnight's Lewis Goodall has been bringing you the latest, and here he is again.
Yes, Victoria. Let's just recap where we are, shall we? Now, we know, as you've been saying, the Conservatives are doing very, very badly indeed in London. We've spoken about Wandsworth, been Conservative since 1978. We've spoken about Westminster, been Conservative since Harold Wilson was Prime Minister in 1964. When we go to the rest of the country, we've talked about the places where the Conservatives are actually continuing to advance. Places like the Amber Valley going forward. Places like Nuneaton, Conservatives going forward. But then you're trying to extrapolate, as people like me, we're trying to sift through these results and extrapolate what they mean in terms of other parts of the country. It becomes complicated because there are lots of other parts of the country where basically there's a sort of stasis. So let's look at somewhere like Derby, very, very important seat. Derby used to be Labour, went to no overall control in 2018. Seat like Derby North, the Conservatives gained in 2019 from Labour, really, really important place. Well, as you can see, it's sort of nip and tuck. 1816, Labour up a bit, Conservatives down a bit, not too bad perhaps. But then you look at somewhere like, I don't know, Bolton. Again, you would expect the Labour Party to be making gains in somewhere like Bolton. Two crucial parliamentary marginal seats. And actually, again, it's kind of stasis really. Conservatives up one, Independents down one. You would really hope that somewhere like that, if you were the Labour Party, they'll be doing a little bit better. And then you look at somewhere as well like Worcester. Again, a Conservative loss. It's sort of got a very historic place in British political mythology, really. You'll remember Worcester Woman. Conservatives down a bit, -3, Labour up a bit, Green up 1, Lib Dems up 1. Shouldn't neglect the Green and Lib Dems story. I think we'll be talking a lot more about the Lib Dems, for example, today as the day goes on, as we get seats like, or counties like Somerset coming back, where the Lib Dems are hoping to do very well. The Greens haven't had a bad night either, about 23 gains so far. They're up about 12% in all of the seats they're standing by comparison to 2018. But as you can see, it's a sort of nip and tuck affair. Basically, we're going back to the status quo ante in lots and lots of places in 2018, one seat up, one seat down. And back in 2018, basically, the Labour Party and Conservative Party were in a sort of uneasy stasis. And we could be looking to return in many parts of the country to that sort of affair, where neither party is able really to predominate over the other. Labour Party would say, though, if they're going back to 2018, that's still an improvement on where they were in 2019 and in 2021. But it's not just England, of course, that we're expecting results. People say, why are you just talking about England? Well, it's just because England is the only place to have voted, counted, I should say, overnight. Plenty of other places have voted as well. We're expecting lots of results from Scotland later today. What is going to happen in Scotland? Well, really, it's probably going to be a battle for second place in Scotland. The SNP likely to continue to dominate north of Hadrian's Wall. You saw back in 2007, the first time the SNP, they entered government in Holyrood, and they won in the local elections, Scottish Council elections as well, and they've maintained their first place. They might even build on it a bit. Quite extraordinary, really, for a party that's been in government in Holyrood since 2007 for 15 years. But there we are. Look out for councils like Glasgow, the SNP hoping to extend their gains in that city, Scotland's biggest city. But the big question is about who comes in second, because back in 2017, you'll remember Ruth Davidson, leading the Conservatives at that time, did very well. The Conservatives leapfrogged Labour to come in second place. The Scottish Conservatives do not anticipate doing that well this time, and the Labour Party hoping to regain second place. But it's a long way from the old hegemony that the Labour Party used to enjoy in Scotland. They'll come second, but it's likely to be a poor second. Wales as well. Wales, the one place of the United Kingdom where the Labour Party has continued to dominate, really, certainly in the Welsh Senate, as we saw last year. They're hoping, the Labour Party hoping to continue that run and to do well in seats like the Vale of Clwyd, in Bridgend, in Ynys Môn, the sort of seats that they lost in 2019 and are hoping to regain at the next parliamentary election. The Conservatives won 6 seats, remember, in Wales in 2019, 6 gains. But perhaps the most important results of all, almost certainly I think the most consequential results of this election, is what's going to happen in Northern Ireland for the Stormont executive. And the big headline that could come from that, many people expect to come from that, is Sinn Féin, the Nationalist Party, overtaking the Unionist Party, the DUP, into first place. You'll see it almost happened the last time the seats were contested in 2017. Nip and tuck really, but the DUP just on top. And the reason that's important is it would be the first time in the 100-year history of the province that a nationalist party had won the poll, had got the most seats in an election, had come top in an election at the very least. And of course that could have really big political repercussions for the whole of the way that the Northern Ireland executive unfolds over the coming years. Really tense situation with the Northern Ireland protocol. We're expecting these results over the next 2 days, but it certainly is going to be extremely consequential and worth looking out for.
Lewis, for the moment, thank you.
It really is in terms of Northern Ireland, because if Sinn Féin do pull it off, that means there is a party in government that favours a united Ireland. Dan Johnson is in Belfast, where the first results are expected actually this afternoon, Dan.
Yeah, they've just started counting here in the last half an hour or so. There are 3 count centres across Northern Ireland. The ballot boxes are being opened here, although we're hearing that there may be a delay at one of those other counting centres. But results not expected until lunchtime, and they could take well into the evening, perhaps into the early hours of tomorrow morning, to get a full picture of the state of each of the parties right across Northern Ireland, and then to work out what that means in terms of representation at Stormont. Who will be the biggest party? It's a proportional representation voting system that is used to allocate seats across the various constituencies across Northern Ireland to decipher who gets exactly what seats in the Stormont Assembly. It takes a little bit of time to work that out, quite a complicated system, but the big thing to watch out for is whether the DUP is able to cling on to its position as the biggest party. Polling across Northern Ireland in the last few weeks, last few months, has suggested that the party is going to suffer significant losses and that it could indeed lose that position of being the biggest party to Sinn Féin. But then there's a huge question about whether power sharing government would actually resume here. There hasn't been a government since February, when the DUP actually withdrew from power sharing in objection to the way that the Northern Ireland Protocol was hitting trade in Northern Ireland. Now they've said they want to see changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol before they'll go back into power sharing. And if Sinn Féin is indeed the biggest party, there's a huge question about whether they would share power in that scenario. So some major constitutional and political questions to be determined in Northern Ireland as a result of these elections, but we're not going to get those results until into this afternoon, this evening, maybe even the early hours of tomorrow morning.
Yeah, and as you say, and even when we do, will it lead to another government? Thanks very much, Dan. We're going to get a sense of what's going on in Scotland now. Lorna, you can see her there. Lorna Gordon is in Glasgow. Update us, Lorna.
Yes, good morning from Glasgow. The count here in Scotland gets underway at 9 o'clock. You see the ballot boxes behind me. That's when they will get tipped out, brought to the counting stations. It's an electronic count here in Scotland, a form of proportional representation here, single transferable votes. They'll start getting tallied in these machines, which look a little bit like printers. That will all get underway at 9 o'clock. 1,200 seats across Scotland in 32 local authorities, 85 of those seats here in Glasgow, so the magic number here is 43. That would be very hard for any party to reach. At the last local election, the SNP got 39. They took control of Glasgow. It was a big result for them here. The themes to look for, of course, are how will the SNP do? They're likely to retain their position as the largest party here in Scotland. That's not really in doubt. They've won the most seats in the last 10 Scottish elections. The big thing to look for really here in Scotland, though, is the battle for second place. The Conservatives had a huge result at the last Scottish local elections, doubling their vote. Will they hold on to that second place position, or will Partygate affect them here? Will Labour bounce back, and if so, by how much? The first local authorities results will start coming in around lunchtime. We should get all the results here in Scotland probably by tea time.
Thanks very much, Lorna. Thank you.
Time now is 8:41. I definitely feel like at this time of the morning, on a Friday morning, on an election morning, we need to speak to Sir John Curtis, who is the Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University. Morning to you, John. I know you've had a very long night. Can you give us your glimpse as to what you think the picture emerging this morning is?
Well, of course, the big question going into these elections was, would they be so bad for the Conservatives that Tory MPs would decide to mount a challenge against the Prime Minister? Now, the evidence on the ballot boxes we've seen counted so far, which only around half the councils in England, is that certainly the Conservatives have suffered a reverse. It confirms the message of the opinion polls that the party is probably now less popular than it has been at any point since the December 2019 general election. But, a loss of 4 points since 2018, 6 points since last year. substantial, but doesn't sound like devastating. And of course, because the Conservatives weren't defending a great deal, that is, we were primarily having elections in the more Labour part of England, the loss in terms of numbers of seats, at least at around 120, doesn't sound that great. That said, it is 1 in 5 of Conservative seats that so far have fallen. And within London, where Labour have performed rather better than they have outside of London, we've not only seen Wandsworth and Barnet fall, which was widely expected, but also seen Labour pick up Westminster, which always looked like a rather more difficult task for them. And it underlines the way in which now London has become almost a one-party city. I think the Conservatives will be left with control of just 4 of the capital's 32 boroughs after all the ballots have been counted.
John, now we were watching Sir Keir Starmer just a few minutes ago. He was in Barnet and in celebration mode. And I think people are going to have to hear this word quite a bit over the next few days, turning point, which is one that he's using. Now, you look at the figures, you look at what's happened before. What justification is there for Sir Keir Starmer and Labour to be talking about a turning point?
Well, Labour Party can certainly rightly claim to have done an awful lot better than they did last year. Their votes up by about 5 or 6 points across England as a whole. But then we have to remember they did so badly last year. It was a really disappointing result for Labour. In London, the party certainly has made progress on what it achieved in 2018. It has done better and achieved a better result than anything that Jeremy Corbyn managed to do as leader. And insofar, perhaps, turning point is code for leaving behind the party's past. In London, arguably that case can be made. The trouble is outside of London, actually the Labour's vote is a little bit lower than it was in 2018. It hasn't done quite as well as Jeremy Corbyn did. And that's not only true of the votes, but actually so far at least, Labour has made a slight net loss of seats outside of London. Now, Labour needs to do well in London to win an election, but doing well in London will not be sufficient. And certainly there is very little sign of the Labour Party making particular progress in some of those Leave-inclined places, traditional Labour places in the north of England and the Midlands. And that certainly is the target that Labour has long been setting itself. Its target has not been to paint London even more red than it is already. It has been to try to reclaim the ground that it has been losing further north.
John, it is clearly emerging this morning that the Liberal Democrat Party can justifiably be making quite a few claims this morning to successes.
Yes, and in a sense, I think one has to say that probably that was the surprise of the night, or perhaps it's the trend we all failed to spot in advance. The party's actually made more gains than Labour has. It's made about 40-50 gains. Its vote's not up dramatically. It's up a couple of points as compared with what it was 4 years ago, but it progresses compared with last year. But I think what the party will be particularly noting is it tended to do rather well when it was fighting the Conservatives from second place. And of course, the Liberal Democrats' chances of doing, at least, well, making some progress in the next general election rest very heavily on taking Tory-held seats in where the Liberal Democrats are currently at second place. So they'll be encouraged that perhaps they might be in a stronger position to do that. So, I mean, even for the Liberal Democrats, turning point probably too strong. A possible foundation to the party beginning finally to crawl out of the slough of despond into which it fell in the 2015 general election as voters rejected its vote in the coalition, perhaps at least an opportunity.
John, always good to catch up with you. Thank you so much for staying up for us. I know you've had a very long night. Nice to see you.
Right.
You're watching BBC Breakfast. Time is 8:59.
Right, let's take a look at what we know so far from the local election results across England.
So people went to the polls in 146 local authority areas with more than 4,000 seats entirety up for grabs.
In the last few minutes, this was how things looked. The Conservatives have lost 122 council seats. Labour has gained 34 seats, plus the key Conservative councils of Wandsworth, Westminster and Barnet. Meanwhile, the Liberal Democrats have gained 59 seats and the Greens are up 23. Here's our political correspondent, Helen Catt.
A symbolic win for Labour. Wandsworth in South London, Tory for 44 years, until now. Even in an election about local services, having the lowest council tax in the country didn't keep it blue.
The cost of living crisis did come up, as did the massive cuts from the government since 2010, and also Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was a vote winner for Labour, as indeed was Keir Starmer as well. And I remind you, Hugh, in 1998, a year after our landslide victory, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth. In 2002, a year after our landslide victory in 2001, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth, and we've done it in 2022.
Wandsworth's former leader blamed the loss on the cost of living and said what he called the issue of Boris Johnson was raised. That was echoed by some Tory councillors elsewhere.
It's Partygate, it's not just Partygate. There's the integrity issue. Basically, I just don't feel people any longer have the confidence that the Prime Minister can be relied upon to tell the truth.
The Conservatives lost Barnet in North London to Labour too, and in a bigger upset, Westminster and Southampton, and they lost control of West Oxfordshire. Although some maintain things aren't as bad as they could be.
We've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture, because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains. And I think if you take the whole picture of this, it really doesn't demonstrate that Labour has the momentum to form the next government.
Labour has said it's a turning point for the party. It won the newly created Cumberland Council in the northwest, but it's not expecting big gains, and it's had losses too. The Liberal Democrats, who've had a strong night, took whole council from it.
And what was really interesting about last night's results, in places like Wimbledon and Cheadle and elsewhere, we were winning seats where we need to win seats in the next general election. So it was a great night for those councillors.
The Greens too have made gains. Also overnight in Bristol, voters chose to scrap their mayor in a referendum. This is all only a partial picture. Almost half of England's councils have yet to start counting and will do so later today. So too will all of the councils in Wales and Scotland. And counting will start for all 90 seats in the Northern Ireland Assembly, with polls suggesting that Sinn Féin could become the largest party for the first time. Helen Catt, BBC News.
In the past hour, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, paid a visit to Barnet in North London, where his party took control of the council from the Conservatives. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Nick Eardley, who is there. OK, so he was happy, wasn't he?
Yeah, morning, Victoria. He was. Barnet's one of those areas that really matters to the Labour Party. It's got a big Jewish population. You remember when Keir Starmer took over as leader, he said his priority was to try and eradicate anti-Semitism. So he sees this as quite a symbolic result. I suppose, though, there's a wider question. So we know the Conservatives have lost a bunch of seats, perhaps not catastrophic, but a bad night. The question is, has Labour done well enough to make us all think that they're ready to potentially win a general election? And in London, the answer is probably yes. You know, they've won those massive councils like Westminster and Wandsworth, totemic councils, big scalps from the Tories. But the question is a bit harder to answer in other parts of the country, and there is an argument that Labour maybe hasn't done as well in, say, the old Red Wall, the old Labour heartlands in the north of England, than it might have wanted to. But Keir Starmer, when he was here about half an hour ago, as you say, was in very good spirits. Have a listen.
This is a massive turning point for the Labour Party. From the depths of 2019, we're back on track now for the general election, showing what the change that we've done, the hard change we've done in the last 2 years, what a difference it has made. And, you know, Cumberland, you know, very important win last night in key constituencies for the next general election. Same in Southampton, many more results to come today. But I just want to thank our brilliant team.
So Keir Starmer in a very good mood this morning. Loads of results still to come in over the course of the day. I'm hearing that Labour might do pretty well in Scotland as well, comparatively anyway, taking back second place from the Tories. Seems to be what people are expecting up there, although the counting's just about to get underway, so we don't know for sure. There's Wales. Labour will want to do well in Wales. And then by the end of the day, we should have a much better picture, Victoria, about how badly the Conservatives have done and whether that's translated into a really good set of results for Labour or just a fairly good set of results for Labour.
Cheers, Nick. Thank you very much. Nick Eardley reporting from Barnet.
The time now is 5 minutes past 9. Let's take a last look at the headlines where you are this morning.
Good morning, I'm Assad Ahmed. It's been a historic night for Labour in London. The party gained control of the previously safe Conservative councils of Barnet, Wandsworth and for the first time ever, Westminster. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer congratulated party members just a short time ago in Barnet.
Wandsworth! Yay! We won Wandsworth. They've been saying that for years. You'll never take Wandsworth. We've just done it. Yay! Westminster. Yes! Absolutely astonishing result. And here in Barnet, such hard, brilliant work.
Well, it was a disappointing night for the Conservatives, with the party losing nearly 70 councillors overnight. Ravi Govinda, leader of Wandsworth Tories, said national issues were partly to blame, whilst the leader of Barnet Conservatives said the results are a bad sign for future general elections. Well, as for the Lib Dems, they've so far kept control of the 2 South West London councils that have counted so far and have gained more than 20 councillors. The Green Party have also gained an additional councillor. Now look at the weather forecast, and we should be in for a decent day. Dry, light cloud and feeling warm as temperatures reach a high of up to 22 Celsius and 21 Celsius in town. Well, there's more local election analysis and results on BBC Radio London and on our website. Have a good morning. Bye-bye.
For the first... Oh dear, I'll start at that again. For the 4th time in a row, the Bank of England...
That's it from me. Victoria, John.
And that's it from us.
Ben, thank you very much. Yes, it's all finished from breakfast this morning. Of course, election coverage across BBC News throughout the day.
Yeah, breakfast will be back tomorrow morning at 6. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.